Sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you becomes the moment that changes everything. There are cries for help that echo through the darkness and reach the one person who can answer them. Emma Callahan never thought her evening walk through Black Ridge would end with her pressed against cold stones, begging outlaws not to take what little dignity she had left. When she whispered, "Please don't lift my skirt," she had no idea that Amos Bear McCreedy was listening from the shadows. For 15 years, this mountain man had avoided the town below. He carried dark secrets and a past soaked in blood. But when he heard Emma's desperate plea, something inside him snapped. What happened next would shake the corrupt town of Black Ridge to its core. Emma's rescue was just the beginning of a plan so ruthless it would make the outlaws wish they had never been born. But here's the question that will keep you awake tonight. What kind of man hears a woman's cry and decides the entire town must pay? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming Territory in 1887 was a place where civilization hung by the thinnest of threads, and nowhere was this more evident than in the town of Black Ridge. Nestled between towering mountains and endless prairie, it should have been a beacon of progress on the frontier. Instead, it had become something darker, a place where decent folk kept their heads down and their voices quiet, where justice was bought and sold like cattle at market. Emma Callahan had lived her entire 23 years, believing Black Ridge was simply home. The daughter of Theodore Callahan, the town's most prominent banker, she moved through her days in the comfortable bubble that money and social standing provided. Her world consisted of church socials, afternoon teas with the other ladies of refinement, and the quiet expectation that she would someday marry well and continue the family's respectable legacy. She had no reason to suspect that her father's bank was the beating heart of a corruption network that stretched its poisonous tendrils through every aspect of the town's life. Theodore Callahan was a good man, caught in an impossible situation, but Emma saw only the loving father who brought her books from Denver and worried when she stayed out past sunset. The Callahan house sat on Prospect Hill, the most fashionable address in Black Ridge, with its wraparound porch and carefully tended garden. Emma's mother had died when she was 12, leaving behind only memories of gentle hands and the scent of lavender water. Theodore had never remarried, pouring all his paternal devotion into his only child, perhaps too much so. He had sheltered her from the harsh realities that governed their world, wanting to preserve her innocence for as long as possible. But innocence, like morning dew, cannot survive the heat of an unforgiving sun. 20 miles north of Black Ridge, in a cabin that few men could find even if they knew where to look, Amos Bear McCreedy split firewood with the methodical precision of a man who had learned that keeping busy kept the ghosts at bay. At 42, he was still powerfully built, though his dark hair now carried silver threads and lines had etched themselves around eyes that had seen too much. The cabin was sparse but well built, constructed with the same attention to detail that had once made him one of the finest cavalry officers in the United States Army. Everything had its place, and everything served a purpose. The only decorations were practical ones: maps of the territory, weather instruments, and shelves lined with books on subjects ranging from military strategy to botanical medicine. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the bedroom lay his most treasured and most painful possession, a cavalry saber with an ornate brass guard, its blade dulled by time but still capable of holding an edge. The leather scabbard was cracked and worn, but the weapon itself remained sound. It had been his father's and his grandfather's before that, carried through 3 wars and countless smaller conflicts. Now it served only as a reminder of honor lost and choices that could never be undone. Amos had not always been a hermit. 15 years earlier, Captain Amos McCreedy had been a rising star in the 7th Cavalry, known for his tactical brilliance and unwavering moral compass. His men trusted him completely, and his superiors valued his ability to accomplish difficult missions with minimal casualties. He was the kind of officer who studied not just the art of war, but the responsibility that came with holding other men's lives in his hands. That moral compass had ultimately proven his undoing. In the summer of 1872, his regiment had been ordered to clear a valley of Lakota families who had refused to relocate to the reservation. The official reports called it a police action, but Amos had seen enough to know it would be a massacre. The families in question were led by an elderly chief named Spotted Elk, who had never raised a weapon against white settlers, but simply wanted to live out his final days on the land where his ancestors were buried. When Amos received orders to attack at dawn, when the families would be defenseless in their sleep, he had faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could follow orders and preserve his career, or he could follow his conscience and damn the consequences. He chose conscience. Instead of attacking, Amos had ridden into the camp under a white flag and warned Spotted Elk of what was coming. The families had time to escape, melting into the wilderness before the main force arrived, to find only cold fire rings and empty lodges. The mission was deemed a failure, and someone had to be held accountable. The court-martial had been a foregone conclusion. Amos was charged with disobedience of direct orders, conduct unbecoming an officer, and communicating with the enemy. His defense that the orders themselves were unlawful and that non-combatant families did not constitute the enemy fell on deaf ears. The army needed a scapegoat for the political embarrassment, and Captain McCreedy fit the role perfectly. He was stripped of his rank, dishonorably discharged, and left to make his way in a world that had no use for a disgraced cavalry officer. The shame had been unbearable, not for what he had done, but for how easily his former comrades had abandoned him when it became inconvenient to remember his years of faithful service. So he had come to the mountains, as far from civilization as he could manage, and built a life of solitude. He hunted and trapped, sold furs and hides to traders who asked no questions about his past, and tried to forget that he had ever worn a uniform or carried the hopes of young soldiers into battle. For 15 years, it had worked. The mountains were indifferent to human judgment, and the animals he shared the wilderness with cared nothing for his disgrace. He had found a measure of peace in the harsh simplicity of survival, in the honest work of providing for his own needs without depending on any man's approval. But peace built on isolation was fragile, and it took only one desperate cry in the darkness to shatter it completely. The town of Black Ridge operated under the iron fist of Sheriff Wade Garrett, a man whose badge was as bought and paid for as everything else in the settlement. Garrett was not stupid, quite the opposite. He was cunning, ruthless, and possessed of the kind of intelligence that recognized opportunity in other men's weaknesses. He had been sheriff for 8 years, and in that time he had transformed what should have been a position of public service into a personal kingdom. Under Garrett's protection, Black Ridge had become a haven for the kind of men who found regular society too restrictive for their tastes. Cattle rustlers, claim jumpers, road agents, and worse, they all knew that a few gold coins placed in the right hands would buy them sanctuary in Black Ridge. The honest ranchers and merchants who formed the backbone of the community lived in constant fear, knowing that crossing the wrong people could result in anything from a mysterious fire to a fatal accident. Judge Cornelius Blackwood presided over this mockery of justice with the enthusiasm of a man who had long since abandoned any pretense of integrity. Garrett's men could commit murder in broad daylight and walk free with a ruling of self-defense, while any citizen who dared to complain might find themselves charged with disturbing the peace or incitement to riot. The criminal network extended its reach through every level of society. Theodore Callahan's bank provided financial services that allowed stolen goods to be converted into legitimate assets. Merchants kept false books to hide protection payments. Even the local newspaper, the Black Ridge Gazette, had learned to report only the news that posed no threat to the established order. It was a system that fed on fear and thrived on the silence of good people who had learned that speaking out carried consequences too terrible to risk. The few who had tried to organize resistance had disappeared or met with tragic accidents, their fate serving as a warning to anyone else who might consider challenging the status quo. Into this poisonous atmosphere, Emma Callahan had lived her sheltered life, protected by her father's position and her own naive assumption that the world was fundamentally a good place where bad things happened only to people who somehow deserved them. She attended church every Sunday, helped organize charity events for the less fortunate, and genuinely believed that the men who ran Black Ridge were flawed but ultimately decent human beings, trying their best in difficult circumstances. Her favorite time of day was the early evening, when the harsh Wyoming sun began to soften and the air carried hints of the coolness to come. She often took walks during this golden hour, sometimes with friends, but just as often alone, savoring the freedom to move through her world without the constant chaperonage that propriety usually demanded. On this particular evening in late September, she had chosen to walk alone. Her father was working late at the bank, as he seemed to do more and more often lately, and the house felt oppressively quiet. She had put on her favorite blue dress, the one with the small white flowers embroidered around the collar, and stepped out into the cooling air, with no destination in mind, except wherever her feet might carry her. She had no way of knowing that her movements were being watched, that plans were already in motion that would shatter her comfortable existence and drag her into the brutal realities that governed the world beyond her father's protection. She could not have imagined that her evening walk would become the catalyst for events that would shake Black Ridge to its very foundations. But 20 miles away in his mountain cabin, Amos McCreedy felt a familiar uneasiness, the kind that had once warned him of Apache war parties and approaching storms. Something was stirring in the world below, something that would soon reach even his carefully maintained isolation. He set down his axe and looked toward the distant town, though it was hidden from view by intervening ridges. For no reason he could name, he found himself thinking of his father's cavalry saber, still wrapped in oiled cloth beneath the floorboards, still sharp enough to serve if the need arose. The mountains held their breath, and the first shadows of evening began to gather in the valleys below. Emma's feet carried her through the familiar streets of Black Ridge as dusk painted the sky in shades of gold and purple. She walked past the mercantile with its cheerful yellow curtains, past the church where she had been baptized and confirmed, past the small houses where families were gathering for evening meals. The normalcy of it all felt comforting, a gentle rhythm that had shaped her entire life. She turned down Maple Street, following an impulse to take the longer route home through the older part of town. Here, the buildings were closer together, their shadows deeper in the failing light. She had walked this way hundreds of times before, but tonight something felt different. The usual sounds of evening children playing, mothers calling them home, the distant lowing of cattle seemed muted, as if the town itself were holding its breath. Emma was humming softly to herself, a hymn she had learned in childhood, when she heard the footsteps behind her. At first, she thought nothing of it. Black Ridge was a small town where everyone knew everyone, and she assumed it was simply another resident heading home for the day. But as she continued walking, the footsteps remained with her, matching her pace with deliberate precision. A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the cooling air. She glanced over her shoulder and saw 3 men following her, their faces shadowed by the brims of their hats. They were not townspeople she recognized, and something in their bearing, predatory, purposeful, made her pulse quicken with instinctive fear. Emma quickened her pace, her heeled boots clicking against the wooden sidewalk with increasing urgency. Behind her, the men's footsteps quickened as well, no longer making any pretense of coincidence. Her breath came faster, and she clutched her small purse tighter, searching the street ahead for any sign of help. The business district was emptying as shop owners closed their doors and headed home for supper. Emma saw old Mr. Henderson locking up his hardware store, but he was already half a block away and moving in the opposite direction. Panic began to bloom in her chest as she realized how isolated she had become in a place she had always considered safe. "Miss Callahan," called a voice behind her, rough and mocking. "No need to hurry. We just want to have a word with you." Emma's blood turned to ice. They knew her name. This was not a random encounter or a case of mistaken identity. These men had sought her out specifically, and the implications of that realization sent terror coursing through her veins. She broke into a run, her blue dress hampering her movements, but desperation driving her forward. The men behind her laughed, a sound that held no warmth or humor. They were in no hurry now, confident in their ability to overtake her whenever they chose. Emma's heeled boots were not made for running, and she stumbled as she turned into the narrow alley between Dobson's bakery and the old grain warehouse. She had hoped the shortcut might give her an advantage, but instead she had trapped herself in a dead end with high brick walls on either side. She reached the end of the alley and spun around, pressing her back against the cold brick. The three men emerged from the shadows like wolves closing in on a cornered deer. In the dim light, she could finally see their faces clearly, and what she saw there made her legs weak with terror. The leader was a man called Jake Torrance, known throughout the territory as one of Sheriff Garrett's most trusted enforcers. He was tall and lean, with pale eyes that seemed to look right through a person, as if calculating their value in terms of pain and suffering. His companions were cut from the same cloth, hard men who made their living through violence and intimidation. "Please," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "I haven't done anything wrong. Whatever you want." "What we want," Torrance interrupted, stepping closer, "is to send your daddy a message. He's been getting ideas lately, thinking maybe he can grow a backbone in his old age. We're here to remind him that some things are more important than conscience." Emma's mind raced, trying to understand what her father could have done to provoke such attention. Theodore Callahan was the gentlest man she knew, devoted to his work and his family. The idea that he might be involved in anything dangerous seemed impossible, but the evidence stood before her in the form of three armed men with violence in their eyes. "My father is a good man," she said, summoning what courage she could find. "He's never hurt anyone in his life." Torrance smiled, and the expression was more frightening than his scowl had been. "That's about to change, Miss Callahan. See, your daddy's been asking too many questions about where certain money comes from and where it goes. Banking is supposed to be a quiet profession, but Theodore's been making noise, so we're going to give him something louder to think about." One of the other men stepped forward, a short, stocky individual with scars crisscrossing his knuckles. "Maybe we start gentle-like. Show her what happens to pretty little girls who don't mind their own business." Emma tried to run again, but there was nowhere to go. Torrance caught her easily, his grip like iron as he forced her back against the wall. The impact drove the breath from her lungs, and she felt her head strike the brick hard enough to bring tears to her eyes. Now, Torrance said, his voice mockingly gentle. "No need to make this harder than it has to be. You cooperate with us, and maybe your daddy gets the message without anything too permanent happening to his precious daughter." Emma's dress tore as she struggled against his grip, the sound of rending fabric loud in the narrow alley. The small white flowers embroidered around the collar scattered like fallen petals as the delicate material gave way. She could feel the rough brick scraping against her arms and knew that her struggles were only making things worse. But she could not stop fighting. "Please, don't lift my skirt," she whispered, the words torn from her throat by desperation and terror. It was all she had left, this final plea for whatever shred of dignity might remain to her. "Please, I'm begging you." The men laughed again, the sound echoing off the brick walls like the cries of scavenging birds. Emma closed her eyes and tried to retreat somewhere deep inside herself, somewhere these men could not follow or touch or violate. She clutched her mother's locket, the one piece of jewelry she never removed, and tried to remember her mother's voice, singing lullabies on dark nights when childhood fears seemed overwhelming. Then the laughter stopped. Emma opened her eyes to see a shadow falling across the alley, mouth a tall, broad silhouette that seemed to absorb what little light remained. The figure moved with deadly silence, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Let her go." The words were quiet, conversational, but they carried more menace than all of Torrance's threats combined. Emma felt the grip on her arms loosen slightly as her attackers turned to face this new threat. In the dim light, she could see little more than the outline of a powerful man dressed in rough frontier clothing, but something about his bearing suggested capabilities that went far beyond anything her attackers possessed. "This ain't your concern, mountain man," Torrance snarled, but Emma heard uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Walk away, and we'll pretend you were never here." The shadow in the alley mouth stepped forward, and Emma caught a glimpse of a face weathered by years of outdoor living, eyes that held the cold clarity of winter mountain lakes. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I said let her go. I won't say it again." What happened next occurred so quickly that Emma's mind could barely process it. The man moved like a force of nature, swift and implacable. She heard the sounds of impact, brief cries of pain, and then sudden, profound silence. When her vision cleared, the three men who had been terrorizing her lay motionless on the alley floor, and the stranger stood over them like an avenging angel carved from mountain stone. Emma stared at her rescuer, hardly daring to believe that her nightmare was over. The man looked back at her, with eyes that seemed to see everything, her terror, her relief, her confusion, and something in his gaze told her that her life had just changed in ways she could not yet comprehend. In her trembling hand, she still clutched her mother's locket, the small silver heart that contained the only photograph she had of the woman who had given her life. It would become her anchor in the days to come, a reminder of love and strength when everything else seemed uncertain. Amos McCreedy knelt beside Emma in the dim alley, his experienced eyes quickly assessing her injuries. She was conscious and alert, which was a good sign. But he could see blood on her arms where the brick had scraped her skin, and her dress was torn in several places. More concerning was the look in her eyes, the glassy stare of someone whose world had just been turned upside down. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice gentler than it had been moments before when dealing with her attackers. Emma nodded weakly and accepted his steadying hand as she struggled to her feet. Her legs felt unsteady, as if they might give way at any moment, but she was determined not to show any more weakness than she already had. She looked down at the three motionless forms on the ground and felt a complicated mixture of relief and horror. "Are they," she began, but could not finish the question. "Alive," Amos said curtly, "though they'll have splitting headaches when they wake up. We need to get you somewhere safe. These men work for people who won't be happy when they don't report back." Emma looked at him more carefully, taking in the weathered features, the clothes that spoke of a life lived far from civilization, the way he moved with the confidence of a man who had faced danger before and emerged victorious. She realized she had never seen him in town, which meant he was either a newcomer or someone who deliberately avoided populated areas. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Name's Amos McCreedy. I live up in the mountains north of here." He glanced toward the mouth of the alley, listening for any sounds that might indicate more trouble was coming. "Right now, what matters is getting you away from here before their friends come looking." Emma's mind was struggling to process everything that had happened. 20 minutes ago, she had been taking a peaceful evening walk through the town where she had lived her entire life. Now, she was standing in an alley with three unconscious men and a stranger who had appeared from nowhere to save her from something too terrible to contemplate. "I need to go home," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she wondered if home would ever feel safe again. "My father will be worried." Amos studied her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing things about her situation that she did not yet understand herself. When he spoke, his words carried a weight that made her stomach clench with apprehension. "Miss, I don't think you understand what just happened here. Those men mentioned your father specifically. They said he's been asking questions about money, making noise where he should have stayed quiet. This attack wasn't random, it was meant to send him a message." Emma felt the world tilt around her as the implications sank in. Her father, the quiet banker who brought her books and worried about her walking alone after dark, was somehow involved in something dangerous enough to warrant threats against his daughter. It seemed impossible, but the evidence lay unconscious at her feet. "That can't be right," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Papa is the most honest man I know. He would never—" "I'm not saying he's dishonest," Amos interrupted. "But honest men sometimes find themselves caught between bad choices and worse ones. If your father's been asking questions, it might be because he's trying to do the right thing in a situation where that's become dangerous." They left the alley together, Amos keeping a careful watch for any signs of pursuit, while Emma struggled to make sense of her new reality. The familiar streets of Black Ridge looked different now. Shadows that had once seemed welcoming now appeared threatening, and every sound made her jump. "Where are we going?" she asked as Amos led her away from the main street. "Somewhere we can talk without being overheard," he replied. "And where you can clean up those cuts before they get infected." He guided her to a small cabin on the outskirts of town that she had never noticed before, the kind of place where traveling hunters or prospectors might spend a night or two before moving on. It was dark and appeared deserted, but Amos seemed to know his way around. He produced a key from somewhere and let them inside. The cabin was sparse but clean, with a stone fireplace, a simple table and chairs, and a narrow bed covered with rough blankets. Amos lit a lamp and gestured for Emma to sit while he gathered supplies to tend her injuries. "This is my place in town," he explained, as he cleaned her cuts with practiced efficiency. "I come down from the mountains every few months for supplies. Keep this cabin for when the weather's too bad to make the trip back in one day." Emma winced as he applied some kind of herbal salve to her wounds, but she was grateful for his gentle touch. Everything about him suggested competence and control, qualities that felt reassuring after the chaos of the attack. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Amos paused in his ministrations, and for a moment his weathered features showed something that might have been old pain. "Let's just say I've seen what happens when good people don't stand up to bad ones. Sometimes a man gets a chance to do the right thing, and he'd better take it." As he worked, Emma found herself studying his hands. They were scarred and calloused from hard work, but they moved with surprising gentleness. Everything about him spoke of a life lived according to his own rules, far from the social expectations and constraints that had governed her own existence. "Those men," she said quietly, "they knew my name. They said Papa had been asking questions about money. What did they mean?" Amos finished bandaging her arm and sat back in his chair. When he looked at her, his expression was serious but not unkind. "Miss Callahan, how much do you know about how your town really works? I mean the parts they don't talk about in church or at tea parties." Emma felt a flush of embarrassment. "I know Papa works very hard at the bank. He's always been respected in the community. People trust him with their money and their business." "I'm sure they do," Amos said. "But banking in a place like Black Ridge isn't always about honest deposits and legitimate loans. Sometimes money changes hands for reasons that wouldn't look good in the ledger books." Emma's stomach dropped as understanding began to dawn. "You're saying my father is involved in something illegal?" "I'm saying your father might have found himself in a position where he had to choose between his conscience and his safety. Maybe yours, too." Amos leaned forward, his expression intense. "Those men tonight weren't trying to rob you or hurt you for their own amusement. They were delivering a message. The question is, what's your father going to do when he receives it?" Outside the cabin, night had fallen completely, and Emma realized that her father would be frantic with worry by now. She had never stayed out this late without sending word, and the attack had driven all thoughts of normal courtesy from her mind. "I have to go home," she said, starting to rise. "Papa will be beside himself." Amos caught her arm gently but firmly. "Not yet. First, we need to figure out what you're walking into. If those men were sent to threaten you, then whoever sent them is watching your house, waiting to see how your father reacts. Walking through the front door right now might not be the safest choice." Emma sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the complexity of a situation she did not fully understand. Everything she had believed about her life, her family, and her community was crumbling around her, and she felt utterly unprepared to navigate this new and dangerous world. But as she sat in the lamplight of the small cabin with this enigmatic mountain man who had risked his own safety to help her, Emma began to realize that perhaps she was stronger than she had ever imagined. The terror of the attack was fading, replaced by something else, a quiet anger at the men who had tried to hurt her, and a growing determination to understand what was really happening in Black Ridge. In her pocket, her mother's locket pressed against her leg like a talisman, reminding her that she came from a line of strong women who had faced their own challenges with courage and grace. Whatever lay ahead, she would not face it as a helpless victim. As dawn broke over Black Ridge, Emma finally understood the full scope of her father's predicament. Amos had spent the night hours carefully explaining the realities of frontier justice, the way corruption could spread through a community like a cancer, and how good men sometimes found themselves trapped between impossible choices. "Your father isn't a criminal," Amos said as he poured coffee from a pot that had been simmering over the fire, "but he's been forced to facilitate things that go against his nature. The question is whether he's finally decided to fight back." Emma accepted the coffee gratefully, though her hands still trembled slightly from the previous night's ordeal. "How do you know so much about all this? You said you live in the mountains, away from town." Amos was quiet for a long moment, staring into his own cup as if it might contain answers to questions he had been avoiding. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old regrets and carefully buried pain. "I wasn't always a mountain man, Miss Callahan. Time was, I wore a uniform and took an oath to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. That was before I learned that sometimes the uniform doesn't matter as much as the man wearing it, and sometimes doing the right thing costs more than most people are willing to pay." Emma studied his weathered features, seeing something in his expression that spoke of wounds that went deeper than anything physical. "What happened to you?" "Same thing that's happening to your father, in a way. I was faced with orders that went against everything I believed in, everything the uniform was supposed to represent. I chose conscience over career, and it cost me everything I thought I was." He stood and walked to a small wooden chest in the corner of the cabin. From it, he withdrew a yellowed piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded many times. When he handed it to Emma, she saw that it was a wanted poster, faded but still legible. The face staring back at her from the rough sketch was unmistakably Amos, though younger and clean-shaven. The text below identified him as Captain Amos McCreedy, wanted for desertion, disobedience of orders, and treason against the United States Army. The reward offered was substantial enough to attract serious attention from bounty hunters. "This is you," Emma said, though it came out as more of a question than a statement. 15 years ago, Amos confirmed. "Before I learned that sometimes the people who pin medals on your chest are the same ones who'll put a knife in your back when it becomes convenient." Emma read the charges more carefully, trying to understand what could have driven a decorated cavalry officer to abandon everything he had worked for. "Treason is a serious accusation. What did you really do?" "I refused to follow orders that would have resulted in the massacre of innocent families. Women, children, old people who had never raised a hand against anyone. My commanding officer wanted to make an example, show the tribes what happened to those who didn't fall in line with government policy." Amos's voice grew harder. I warned them instead, gave them time to escape before the attack came. And for that, they called you a traitor? They called me worse than that. Court-martial painted me as a man who valued savage lives over civilized order, someone who had gone native and forgotten his duty to his own kind. Truth is, I just couldn't stomach the idea of killing children in their sleep and calling it military necessity. Emma felt a complex mixture of emotions as she absorbed this revelation. The man who had saved her was himself a fugitive, someone who had sacrificed everything for a principle that most people would never understand. It explained his isolation, his wariness, and the deadly competence he had displayed in the alley. Is that why you live alone in the mountains? Because you're still wanted? Partly. But mostly because I learned that civilization isn't always civilized, and sometimes the wilderness is more honest about what it is. Amos took the poster back and returned it to the chest. Men like Sheriff Garrett and Judge Blackwood wear badges and robes, but they're no different from the animals I hunt for food. At least the animals are honest about their nature. Emma was beginning to understand the depth of corruption that infected her hometown. You know about the sheriff and the judge? About what they've been doing? I've been watching from a distance for years. Black Ridge isn't the only town that's been taken over by men who understand that fear is more effective than law. But I told myself it wasn't my problem anymore, that I'd done my share of fighting other people's battles. What changed your mind? Amos looked at her with an expression that was both gentle and fierce. I heard a young woman begging for her dignity in a dark alley, and I remembered what it felt like to believe that some things are worth fighting for. As the morning progressed, Amos shared more details about the criminal network that had taken root in Black Ridge. Sheriff Garrett was the obvious face of corruption, but he answered to other men, territorial politicians and businessmen who saw frontier towns as opportunities for profit without oversight. Judge Blackwood provided legal cover for their activities, while men like Theodore Callahan were forced to provide financial services that laundered stolen goods and illegal profits. Your father probably started small, Amos explained. Maybe he looked the other way on a questionable transaction or two, told himself it wasn't really his business as long as the paperwork looked legitimate. But once you're in, they don't let you out. Every compromise makes the next one easier, until you wake up one day and realize you're trapped. Emma thought about her father's increasing absence from home, the worry lines that had appeared around his eyes, the way he sometimes stared off into the distance, as if contemplating problems too large for one man to solve. She had attributed it to the normal stresses of business, but now she understood that he had been carrying a much heavier burden. What can we do? She asked. If Papa is trapped, if the whole town is controlled by these people, what chance do we have? We! Amos raised an eyebrow. Miss Callahan, this isn't your fight. Best thing for you would be to get on the next stage out of here, maybe go visit some relatives back east until this all settles down. Emma felt a flash of anger that surprised her with its intensity. Those men attacked me specifically because I'm Theodore Callahan's daughter. They made it my fight when they decided to use me to threaten him. I won't run away and leave Papa to face this alone. Amos studied her for a long moment, and she had the impression he was seeing her clearly for the first time. Whatever he saw seemed to meet with his approval, because when he spoke again, his tone had changed from protective to respectful. All right then, but if you're going to be part of this, you need to understand what you're getting into. These aren't schoolyard bullies who'll back down if you stand up to them. They're killers who've built their power on the graves of people who got in their way. Fighting them means accepting that you might not survive, and that even if you do, you'll never be the same person you were before. Emma thought about the previous evening, about the terror she had felt, and the helplessness that had nearly overwhelmed her. Then she thought about her mother's locket, about the strength of the women who had come before her, and about the kind of person she wanted to be when faced with a choice between safety and justice. I understand, she said, and meant it. What do we do first? Amos smiled for the first time since she had met him, and the expression transformed his weathered features completely. First, we figure out exactly how deep this corruption goes and who we can trust. Then we start planning how to cut it out, like the cancer it is. Outside the cabin, Black Ridge was waking up to another day of carefully maintained lies and hidden fears. But in the small room, where a disgraced cavalry officer and a banker's daughter shared coffee and dangerous truths, something new was beginning, a partnership that would either save the town or destroy them both in the attempt. 3 days after the attack, Emma sat at Amos's rough-hewn table, studying a hand-drawn map of Black Ridge that revealed the town in ways she had never imagined. Every building, every alley, every potential escape route was marked with the precision of a military campaign. Red X marks indicated locations where Garrett's men typically stationed themselves, while blue circles showed the homes and businesses of people who might be trusted. Your knowledge of who lives where and how they're connected has been invaluable, Amos said, adding another notation to the map. I've been watching from the outside for years, but you understand the social structure in ways I never could. Emma traced her finger along Main Street, noting how Amos had marked the subtle defensive positions that she had never noticed before. The barber shop provided a clear view of the bank and courthouse, while the hotel's second-floor windows commanded the entire business district. What she had always seen as a simple frontier town was actually a carefully controlled fortress. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that her husband saw unusual activity at the warehouse district 2 nights ago, Emma said, referring to conversations she had carefully cultivated with townspeople over the past few days. Men loading wagons after midnight, heading south toward the territorial road. That fits with what I observed from the ridge, Amos replied, making another mark on the map. Whatever they're moving, they don't want it seen in daylight. Could be stolen cattle, could be goods from stage robberies, could be something worse. Emma had been amazed by Amos's ability to gather intelligence while remaining essentially invisible. He moved through the wilderness around Black Ridge like a ghost, observing patterns of activity that revealed far more than any single incident. His military training was evident in every aspect of his planning, from the methodical way he documented information to his instinctive understanding of tactical advantages. "Tell me about the judge's house," Amos said, pointing to an elaborate residence on Prospect Hill. "You've been inside for social functions. What's the layout like?" Emma closed her eyes, remembering dinner parties and charity events she had attended with her father. Large front parlor for entertaining, dining room that seats 12, kitchen and servants' quarters in the back. Judge Blackwood's study is on the 2nd floor, facing the street. That's where he keeps his private papers. Guards? Not that I ever noticed, but then I wasn't looking for them. He has a housekeeper, Mrs. Garrett, she's the sheriff's aunt, and there's usually a man who helps with the horses and groundskeeping. Amos made detailed notes, his expression thoughtful. Family? His wife died several years ago. No children. He lives alone except for the staff. Emma paused, remembering something that had always struck her as odd. He does receive a lot of visitors, though. Men who don't look like the usual territorial politicians or businessmen. They come at strange hours and never stay long. That study would be worth a closer look, Amos mused. If there's documentary evidence of the corruption network, that's where it would be kept. Emma felt a chill of excitement mixed with terror. You're talking about breaking into Judge Blackwood's house. I'm talking about gathering intelligence that might give us leverage against people who think they're untouchable. Knowledge is often more powerful than guns, Miss Callahan, and a lot less likely to get innocent people killed. Over the past 3 days, Emma had been living a carefully constructed double life. During the day, she appeared to have recovered from her accident, the story she and Amos had agreed upon to explain her absence and injuries. She attended church, visited with friends, and maintained the facade of a young woman whose greatest concern was choosing fabric for a new dress. But beneath the surface, she was learning skills she had never imagined needing. Amos had taught her how to observe without seeming to watch, how to ask innocent questions that revealed important information, and how to move through familiar spaces with new awareness of potential dangers and opportunities. "Your father hasn't contacted the sheriff about your attack," Amos observed. "That tells us something significant." Emma nodded, though the realization still pained her. Theodore Callahan's failure to report the assault on his daughter could only mean that he understood the futility of seeking official justice. Either he knew that Sheriff Garrett was part of the problem, or he feared that involving the law would only make things worse. "Papa's been different since that night," she said quietly. "More distant, more worried. He stays at the bank until very late, and I sometimes hear him pacing his study when he thinks I'm asleep. He's trying to figure out how to protect you without compromising whatever principles he has left," Amos said with sympathy. "It's not an easy position for a good man to find himself in." Emma had been struggling with her own feelings about her father's situation. Part of her was angry that he had allowed himself to become entangled in corruption, while another part recognized that he might have had little choice if he wanted to keep his family safe. The black-and-white morality of her sheltered upbringing was giving way to a more complex understanding of how good people could be forced into bad situations. "What do you think he'll do?" she asked. "Depends on how much courage he can summon and whether he believes there's any chance of success. Right now, he probably feels like he's facing an impossible choice between his conscience and your safety." Emma studied the map again, noting the defensive positions and escape routes that Amos had identified. She was beginning to understand the methodical way he approached problems, breaking them down into manageable components and identifying every possible advantage. "You've been planning this for a long time, haven't you?" she said. "Not just since my attack, but for years." Amos was quiet for a moment, his finger tracing patterns on the worn wood of the table. "I told myself I was just staying informed about the area where I lived. But maybe part of me always knew that someday I'd have to choose between staying hidden and doing what was right. And my attack made that choice for you? Your attack reminded me that isolation is a luxury, and that sometimes the cost of staying uninvolved is too high to pay." He looked at her directly. "I've spent 15 years running from the consequences of doing the right thing. Maybe it's time to stop running." Emma felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee she was drinking. This man had already sacrificed everything once for his principles, and now he was preparing to risk his hard-won safety for her and for people he barely knew. It was the kind of courage she had read about in books but never expected to see in real life. "What's our next step?" she asked. "We need to establish contact with other people who might be willing to stand up to Garrett's network. There have to be others like your father, decent people who've been forced into compromise, but who might be willing to fight if they thought there was a chance of winning." Emma thought about the people she knew in Black Ridge, trying to identify those who might be potential allies versus those who were either too frightened or too compromised to trust. It was a delicate calculation, because approaching the wrong person could mean exposure and death. "Dr. Morrison might help us," she said finally. "He's treated injuries that he knew came from Garrett's men, but he's never been able to speak out because he's the only doctor for 50 miles. People would die without his services." "Good. Who else?" "Mr. Patterson, who runs the feed store. His son was beaten badly last year for refusing to sell supplies to men he knew were rustlers. And maybe Sarah Jenkins, her husband, disappeared after he started asking questions about the territorial land grants." Amos made careful notes about each potential ally, along with what Emma knew about their situations and motivations. The list was depressingly short, but it was a beginning. "We'll need to approach them very carefully," he said. "One person at a time, and only after we're certain they can be trusted. The network we're fighting has eyes and ears everywhere." As evening approached, Emma prepared to return to town and resume her role as Theodore Callahan's innocent daughter. It was becoming more difficult to maintain the pretense, especially when she looked at her father and saw the weight of secrets and compromises carved into his features. "Be patient," Amos counseled as she prepared to leave. Change takes time, and we only get one chance to do this right. If we move too quickly or trust the wrong people, we'll end up dead, and nothing will have been accomplished. Emma nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words, even as her heart burned with impatience for justice. She touched her mother's locket, drawing strength from the knowledge that she was no longer facing this alone. Emma found the letter hidden beneath her jewelry box when she returned home that evening, her hands trembling as she recognized her father's careful script. The paper was worn, as if it had been written and rewritten many times, and when she unfolded it, she understood why Theodore Callahan had been looking so haunted in recent days. "My dearest Emma," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then something has happened to force my hand, and I can no longer protect you through silence alone. I have failed you as a father by allowing myself to become entangled in matters that go against everything your mother and I tried to teach you about right and wrong." Emma sank onto her bed, her heart racing as she continued reading. The letter detailed years of gradual compromise, beginning with small favors that seemed harmless and escalating into direct participation in money laundering and fraud. Her father described the threats that had been made against both of them, the way good men had been systematically corrupted or eliminated, and his own desperate attempts to find a way out that wouldn't result in their deaths. "They came to me 3 years ago," Theodore had written, "not with demands but with requests that seemed reasonable, a few transactions that needed to be handled quietly, loans that required flexible documentation. They spoke of the greater good, of bringing prosperity to our territory, of the necessity of working within practical realities rather than idealistic principles. By the time I understood what I had become part of, it was too late to extract myself without consequences that would have extended far beyond my own life. They made it clear that your safety depended on my cooperation, and I found myself trapped in a web that grew stronger with every compromise I made." Emma's hands shook as she read her father's detailed confession. He had documented everything: names, dates, amounts, the elaborate network of corruption that stretched from Black Ridge to the territorial capital and beyond. It was evidence that could destroy dozens of powerful men, but only if it could be presented to authorities who weren't already bought and paid for. "I have been trying for months to find a way to expose this corruption without putting you at risk," the letter continued. "But recent events have convinced me that safety through silence is an illusion. They will continue to demand more and more until there is nothing left of the man I once was, and eventually they will have no further use for either of us. I am leaving these documents in your hands because I believe you have the courage and intelligence to find a way to use them that I have not been able to discover. Trust no one in positions of official authority, but look for those who have also suffered under this system. Sometimes the most unlikely alliances produce the most powerful results." The letter was signed with a shaky hand, and attached to it were copies of bank records, correspondence, and financial documents that painted a comprehensive picture of the criminal enterprise that had taken root in their community. Emma spread the papers across her bed, overwhelmed by the scope of the corruption her father had documented. Theodore had been methodical in his record-keeping, perhaps hoping that someday the evidence would be useful in bringing justice to those who had destroyed so many lives. The documents showed connections between Sheriff Garrett, Judge Blackwood, territorial politicians, and businessmen from as far away as Denver and San Francisco. Black Ridge was just one node in a network that extended across the entire region. Emma studied the financial records with growing understanding. Her father had been forced to facilitate the conversion of stolen goods into legitimate assets, but he had also been secretly documenting every transaction in a parallel set of books. The evidence was detailed enough to support criminal prosecutions if it could be presented to honest authorities. More importantly, the records revealed the identities of other victims, people who had been forced into cooperation or who had suffered when they refused to comply. Dr. Morrison's name appeared several times, along with notations about medical treatments he had been forced to provide without asking questions. Mr. Patterson was listed as someone who had been persuaded to extend credit to known criminals. Sarah Jenkins's husband was mentioned in connection with land fraud schemes that had ultimately cost him his life. Emma realized that her father had been building a case for years, waiting for an opportunity to strike back that never seemed to come. Now, somehow, that burden had fallen to her, and she found herself both terrified and exhilarated by the responsibility. She carefully gathered the documents and hid them in a place where even the most thorough search would be unlikely to find them. Then she sat by her window, looking out at the familiar streets of Black Ridge and seeing them with completely new eyes. Every building, every person, every seemingly innocent interaction was part of a larger pattern that her father had risked everything to document. The next morning, Emma made her way to Amos's cabin with a sense of purpose that had been building since she first read her father's confession. She found him splitting wood behind the building, his movements economical and precise, and she could see the soldier he had once been in the way he approached even mundane tasks with disciplined efficiency. "My father left me something," she said without preamble, producing the documents from beneath her shawl. Amos set down his axe and examined the papers with the careful attention of someone who understood their significance. His expression grew increasingly grim as he read through Theodore's detailed accounting of the corruption network, and when he finally looked up, Emma saw a mixture of respect and concern in his eyes. "Your father's been playing a dangerous game," he said quietly, "keeping records like this while pretending to cooperate. If they suspected what he was doing, they would have killed him already. He says he's been looking for a way to use the evidence without getting us both killed, but recent events have convinced him that staying quiet won't protect us indefinitely." Amos nodded thoughtfully. "He's right about that. Men like Garrett and Blackwood don't leave loose ends, and once they decide you know too much to be trusted, cooperation becomes irrelevant. The question is, what we do with this information." Emma had been thinking about that very question since finding the letter. "Papa says we can't trust anyone in official authority, but that we should look for allies among other victims. What if we use this evidence to convince people like Dr. Morrison and Mr. Patterson to stand with us?" "It's possible," Amos said, "but it's also risky. Approaching people with evidence like this forces them to make a choice they might not be ready for. Some might decide their safety depends on reporting our approach to Garrett. Then what do you suggest?" Amos was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents with the intensity of a military strategist planning a campaign. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned experience. "We use this evidence as leverage, but carefully and selectively. Instead of trying to build a large coalition that might include informants, we focus on the key people who have the most to gain from seeing this network destroyed. We give them pieces of the information they need to protect themselves, while keeping the most damaging evidence in reserve." Emma felt a thrill of understanding. Create a situation where they have to choose sides, but make sure choosing our side is clearly in their best interest. Exactly, and we do it in a way that makes it impossible for them to betray us without destroying themselves in the process. As they worked through the implications of Theodore's evidence, Emma found herself thinking about the man who had raised her with such careful love and protection. She had always known her father was intelligent and principled, but she was only now beginning to understand the courage it had taken to maintain his humanity while trapped in an impossible situation. "We have to save him," she said quietly. "Whatever we do, we can't let them hurt Papa for trying to do the right thing." Amos looked at her with an expression that was both gentle and fierce. "We'll save him, Miss Callahan. We'll save all of them if we can. But first, we need to make sure we don't get ourselves killed in the process." Outside the cabin, the mountains stood silent and eternal, indifferent to human struggles but somehow reassuring in their permanence. Emma touched her mother's locket and felt a strange sense of connection to all the women who had faced impossible choices and found the strength to do what was necessary. The game was about to change, and for the first time since her attack, Emma felt like they might actually have a chance of winning. Emma was carefully cleaning Amos's cabin when she discovered the loose floorboard beneath his bed, and what she found hidden there changed everything she thought she knew about the man who had saved her life. Wrapped in oiled cloth was not just the cavalry saber she had expected, but a collection of military documents that painted a picture completely different from the story of disgrace and dishonor that Amos had told her. The first document was a commendation signed by General William Sherman himself, praising Captain Amos McCreedy for his extraordinary courage and moral fortitude in preventing the massacre of innocent civilians while maintaining the highest standards of military honor. The second was a classified report detailing how Amos's actions had ultimately prevented a tribal uprising that could have cost hundreds of lives on both sides. But it was the third document that made Emma's hands tremble as she read it. A secret War Department memo, dated 3 months after Amos's court-martial, revealed that his disgrace had been deliberately orchestrated to protect a covert operation. The families he had warned were not random civilians, but the relatives of a Lakota chief who was secretly working with the army to negotiate peace treaties. The massacre order had been a test, designed to identify officers who could be trusted with sensitive diplomatic missions. Amos had passed the test, but the cost had been his public reputation and his military career. The memo made it clear that the War Department had intended to rehabilitate him quietly and give him command of special operations that required absolute moral integrity. But by the time they were ready to reveal the truth, Amos had disappeared into the wilderness, and all attempts to contact him had failed. Emma sat on the cabin floor, surrounded by evidence that the man she thought she knew was actually a decorated hero whose sacrifice had been far greater than she had imagined. He had not simply chosen conscience over career. He had allowed himself to be branded a traitor to protect a peace process that had ultimately saved countless lives. The sound of approaching footsteps made her quickly rewrap the documents and replace them beneath the floorboard, but her mind was racing with the implications of what she had discovered. When Amos entered the cabin a few minutes later, she struggled to maintain her composure while looking at him with completely new eyes. "You found them," he said quietly, and Emma realized that her attempt at concealment had been unsuccessful. "I was just cleaning, and the floorboard was loose," she began, but Amos held up a hand to stop her explanation. "It's all right. Maybe it's time you knew the whole truth." He sat down across from her, his weathered features showing a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. "What did you read?" "Enough to know that everything you told me about your disgrace was only part of the story," Emma said. "You weren't court-martialed for disobedience, you were tested for loyalty to something higher than following orders." Amos nodded slowly. The army needed to know which officers could be trusted with operations that required moral judgment rather than blind obedience. The test was designed to identify men who would refuse unlawful orders, even at the cost of their careers. "And you passed the test." "I passed the test, but I failed everything else that mattered. I was supposed to help negotiate peace treaties that could have prevented years of bloodshed. Instead, I ran away to the mountains and let other men handle work that I was specifically chosen to do." Emma felt a mixture of anger and sympathy as she began to understand the full scope of Amos's burden. "They let you think you were disgraced while planning to give you even more responsibility? How could they do that to you?" "Because the peace process was too important to risk exposure. If word had gotten out that the army was secretly working with tribal leaders, there were people on both sides who would have sabotaged the negotiations. My disgrace had to be convincing enough to fool everyone, including me. But why didn't they tell you the truth afterwards? Why did they let you disappear?" Amos stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that had been his refuge for 15 years. "They tried. But by the time they were ready to reveal what had really happened, I was already gone, and I didn't want to be found. I was tired of being manipulated, even for good reasons. I wanted to control my own destiny, even if that meant living in exile. Emma tried to process this revelation and its implications for their current situation. Amos, if this is all true, then you're not a fugitive at all. You're a decorated war hero who's been hiding from responsibilities that were always meant to be yours. The responsibilities changed, but the principle remains the same. I was selected for missions that required someone willing to sacrifice everything for what's right. The question is whether I'm still that man, or whether 15 years of hiding have made me into something else. Emma stood and faced him directly, her voice firm with conviction. The man who saved me in that alley, who's been planning to take on an entire corruption network for the sake of people he barely knows, that man is exactly who the army thought you were, maybe even more so. Amos turned from the window, and Emma saw something in his expression that she had never seen before: hope mixed with determination. If that's true, then maybe it's time to stop running from who I was meant to be. The implications of this revelation extended far beyond Amos's personal story. If he was not actually a fugitive, then he had resources and connections that could change everything about their fight against the corruption in Black Ridge. More importantly, it meant that Emma's instinctive trust in his character had been justified in ways she had never imagined. "What does this mean for our plans?" she asked. "It means we have options I didn't think we had," Amos replied. "There are people in positions of authority who knew the truth about my service record. If I can make contact with them, we might be able to get help from sources that Garrett's network can't touch." Emma felt a surge of excitement as she began to understand the possibilities. Federal authorities who aren't part of the territorial corruption? Military intelligence, War Department investigators, maybe even federal marshals who specialize in territorial crimes. The network your father documented isn't just local corruption, it's the kind of criminal enterprise that threatens federal authority in the territories. And they would listen to you because of who you really are. Amos nodded, though his expression remained cautious. They would listen, but that doesn't guarantee they would act. Federal intervention in territorial affairs is always complicated, and there are political considerations that go beyond simple justice. Emma thought about her father's documents and the scope of the corruption they revealed. But if we can provide evidence of criminal activity that threatens federal interests, that changes the political calculation. Exactly. The question is whether we can make contact with the right people without exposing ourselves to additional danger. As they discussed the possibilities, Emma realized that this revelation fundamentally changed not just their tactical options, but their entire understanding of what they were fighting for. This was not just about local justice or personal revenge. It was about restoring legitimate authority to a region that had been systematically corrupted by criminal elements. "There's something else," Amos said, returning to the hidden documents and withdrawing one final paper that Emma had not seen before. "This is a commission that was prepared but never delivered. If I choose to accept it, I would be reinstated to active duty with the rank of major, assigned to special operations in the territories." Emma stared at the official document, realizing that Amos was being offered not just redemption, but promotion and recognition for his years of sacrifice. "Would you accept it?" "That depends on whether you think the mission is worth completing," he said, looking at her intently. "Because if I do this, you would be part of it. Your knowledge of the local situation and your father's evidence would be crucial to any federal investigation." Emma felt the weight of the decision before them. Accepting federal involvement would mean greater resources and legitimate authority, but it would also mean operating within official constraints and political considerations that might limit their ability to achieve true justice. But as she looked at Amos, this man who had sacrificed everything twice for principles that transcended personal interest, she knew there was really only one choice that honor would allow. "Yes," she said firmly, "the mission is worth completing, and I'll do whatever is necessary to help you succeed." Amos smiled, and for the first time since she had known him, Emma saw him as he truly was not a broken exile, but a warrior who had finally found his way back to the fight he was meant to wage. Major Amos McCreedy, he was getting used to the title again, spread the detailed operational plans across the table in his cabin as dawn broke over the Wyoming mountains. The documents represented 3 weeks of intensive planning, coordination with federal authorities, and careful preparation for what would either be the salvation of Black Ridge or the death of everyone involved in the attempt. Emma studied the battle plans with the focused attention of someone who understood that her life depended on every detail being executed perfectly. The operation would unfold in 3 coordinated phases: intelligence gathering and evidence preservation, neutralization of key criminal leadership, and establishment of legitimate territorial authority. Each phase had multiple contingencies and fallback positions, reflecting Amos's military training and his deep understanding of how quickly situations could deteriorate. "The federal marshals will be in position by tomorrow evening," Amos said, pointing to positions marked on the map. "Marshal Davis has 24 men, all experienced in territorial law enforcement. They'll establish a perimeter around Black Ridge and be ready to move when we give the signal." Emma traced the deployment positions with her finger, noting how thoroughly Amos had planned for every possible escape route and defensive position. "What about the evidence? If something goes wrong, we need to make sure Papa's documents reach the right people." "Already handled," Amos replied, producing a receipt from the Territorial Telegraph Office. "Copies of all critical documents have been transmitted to the War Department, the Justice Department, and the Territorial Governor's Office. Even if we don't survive, the investigation will continue." The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of activity as Amos re-established contact with his former colleagues and Emma worked to identify reliable allies within Black Ridge. The process had been more complex than either of them had anticipated, requiring careful verification of loyalties and extensive background investigations to ensure that their plans would not be betrayed. Dr. Morrison had been their first recruit, once he understood that federal protection would be available for those who testified against the corruption network. His medical records provided crucial evidence of injuries that Sheriff Garrett's men had inflicted on people who refused to cooperate with their demands. More importantly, his position in the community gave him access to information about when and where criminal activities were planned. Mr. Patterson had required more persuasion, but the revelation that his son's beating had been documented by federal investigators convinced him that silence would not guarantee safety. His knowledge of supply chains and transportation had revealed how stolen goods moved through the territory, providing intelligence that would allow federal forces to intercept several major criminal operations. Sarah Jenkins had been the most valuable ally, though approaching her had been the most dangerous. Her husband's death had left her with nothing to lose and everything to gain from seeing his killers brought to justice. More importantly, she possessed copies of the territorial land documents that her husband had died trying to expose, providing another crucial piece of the evidence needed to build federal cases against the entire network. "The most dangerous part will be the initial phase," Amos said, returning Emma's attention to the operational details. "We need to gather final evidence and ensure that key witnesses are protected before Garrett realizes what's happening. Once we move openly, everything has to happen very quickly." Emma understood the delicate timing involved. They needed to gather enough evidence to guarantee convictions while avoiding premature exposure that would allow the criminals to escape or retaliate against witnesses. The margin for error was virtually non-existent, and the consequences of failure would extend far beyond their own deaths. "What about Papa?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would be difficult to hear. "Your father is the key to everything," Amos replied gently. "His cooperation will make the difference between a successful operation and a disaster that destroys innocent people along with the guilty ones. But approaching him directly is too risky if he's being watched. Any contact could trigger immediate retaliation." Emma had been struggling with this aspect of the plan for days. Theodore Callahan's position made him both crucial to success and impossible to contact safely. He possessed the most detailed knowledge of the financial aspects of the corruption network, but he was also under constant surveillance by people who would kill him and Emma both if they suspected betrayal. "I have an idea about that," Emma said, producing a letter she had been working on for several days. "What if we let Papa find us, instead of trying to approach him directly?" Amos read the carefully crafted message, his eyebrows rising as he understood Emma's strategy. The letter was designed to look like a routine social invitation, but it contained coded references that would tell Theodore exactly where and when he could make contact if he chose to do so. More importantly, it provided him with information about federal protection that would help him make an informed decision about cooperation. "This could work," Amos said thoughtfully, "but it's also the point of greatest vulnerability. If your father decides that cooperating is too dangerous, he might feel compelled to warn Garrett about what we're planning. Papa won't betray us," Emma said with conviction. "He's been looking for a way to fight back for years. When he understands that he finally has allies with the power to win, he'll do the right thing." Amos studied her for a long moment, and Emma realized he was seeing the same strength and determination that had convinced federal authorities to support their operation. Over the past 3 weeks, she had transformed from a sheltered banker's daughter into a capable intelligence operative, and the change was reflected in every aspect of her bearing. "All right," he said finally. "We'll proceed with your plan, but we need to have contingencies in place if things go wrong." The contingencies were sobering in their brutality. If Theodore Callahan chose to warn the criminals, if any of their allies proved unreliable, if the timing went wrong in any significant way, the fallback plan involved Amos and a small team of federal agents fighting their way out of Black Ridge while sacrificing any hope of bringing the full network to justice. "I understand the risks," Emma said quietly, "but we can't save everyone if we're not willing to trust anyone. Sometimes you have to believe that good people will choose to do good things when given the chance." Amos nodded, recognizing his own younger idealism in her words. "Your optimism might be our greatest weapon, Miss Callahan. I've spent so many years focusing on what could go wrong that I'd almost forgotten what it feels like to believe that things could go right." As the final preparations continued, Emma found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 weeks ago, she had been a naive young woman whose greatest concern was choosing appropriate fabric for social events. Now, she was helping to plan a military operation that would determine the fate of everyone she had ever known. The transformation had not been easy, learning to think tactically, to evaluate people in terms of their potential usefulness or danger, to accept that violence might be necessary to achieve justice. All of these lessons had challenged everything she had been taught about how civilized people should behave. But as she looked at the detailed plans spread across the table, Emma realized that civilization itself sometimes required uncivilized methods to preserve it. The corruption that had taken root in Black Ridge was not something that could be defeated through polite conversation and social pressure. It required the kind of direct action that only people like Amos were trained to provide. "When this is over," she said, "what happens to us? Do you return to active duty? Do I go back to being Theodore Callahan's sheltered daughter?" Amos was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something beyond the cabin walls. "I don't think either of us can go back to what we were before. Too much has changed, and we've seen too much to pretend that ignorance is still possible." Emma nodded, understanding that the innocence she had lost could never be recovered. But as she touched her mother's locket, she realized that what she had gained, knowledge, capability, purpose, might be more valuable than what she had sacrificed. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it completely. Outside the cabin, the mountains stood eternal and indifferent, having witnessed countless human struggles throughout the centuries. But inside, 2 people who had found each other in darkness were preparing to bring light to a place that had been shadowed by corruption for too long. The final battle for Black Ridge was about to begin. Emma's hands remained steady as she pinned her mother's wedding ring to the inside of her dress, positioning it where she could feel its reassuring weight against her heart. The ring had belonged to 3 generations of strong women, and today it would serve as her talisman as she walked into the most dangerous situation of her life. The autumn social at Judge Blackwood's mansion was the perfect cover for the operation's first phase. Half the town's elite would be present, including many of the people whose criminal activities were about to be exposed. Emma would move among them as she had dozens of times before, gathering final intelligence while federal agents took positions around the property. "Remember," Amos said, adjusting the small derringer concealed in Emma's reticule, "your job is to observe and confirm, not to take risks. If anything feels wrong, get out immediately." Emma nodded, though they both knew that once she entered the mansion, her safety would depend entirely on her ability to maintain her facade as the innocent banker's daughter. One wrong word, one suspicious glance, and she would be surrounded by people who would kill her without hesitation. The social was already in full swing when Emma arrived, her blue silk dress and carefully arranged hair making her indistinguishable from any other young lady of good family. She moved through the familiar rituals of frontier society, polite greetings, meaningless conversation about the weather, careful attention to social hierarchies that seemed absurdly trivial, given what she now knew about the people involved. Judge Blackwood held court in his study, entertaining a select group of men whose presence confirmed much of what Emma and Amos had suspected about the scope of the corruption network. She recognized territorial politicians, wealthy ranchers, and businessmen from neighboring towns, all gathered in the kind of exclusive setting where serious criminal business could be conducted under the guise of social interaction. "Emma, my dear," Judge Blackwood called out when he noticed her approaching the study. "How lovely to see you. I trust your father is well?" "Very well, thank you, Judge Blackwood," Emma replied, though her heart raced at the implication behind his seemingly innocent question. "He sends his regrets that business prevented him from attending tonight." "Business, yes," the judge said with a knowing smile. "Your father has always been such a dedicated banker. We all appreciate his commitment to serving the community's financial needs." Emma forced herself to smile in return, understanding that every word was loaded with meaning that the other guests could not decipher. Judge Blackwood was letting her know that her father's activities were being monitored, while she was acknowledging that the surveillance was understood and accepted. She excused herself and moved through the other rooms, her trained eye noting details that would have been invisible to her just a month earlier. Sheriff Garrett was present but remained near the exits, positioned to control access and prevent unwanted departures. His deputies circulated among the guests, their presence disguised as social attendants, but their tactical positioning unmistakable to anyone who understood what to look for. In the dining room, Emma encountered Sarah Jenkins, who was serving as part of the kitchen staff for the evening. Their eyes met briefly, and Sarah's almost imperceptible nod confirmed that the federal agents were in position and ready to move when the signal came. "Miss Callahan," a voice behind her said, and Emma turned to find Jake Torrance, the man who had attacked her in the alley. Her blood turned to ice, but she forced herself to maintain her composure as he approached with the confidence of someone who believed he had nothing to fear from a banker's sheltered daughter. "Mr. Torrance," she replied, her voice steady despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced." "No, but I feel like we know each other," Torrance said with a smile that held no warmth. "I've been keeping an eye on you lately, making sure you're staying safe. These are dangerous times for young ladies who wander around alone after dark." Emma understood the threat perfectly, but she also recognized an opportunity to gather crucial intelligence. "How thoughtful of you. I appreciate knowing that concerned citizens are watching out for the community's welfare." "Oh, we're very concerned about welfare," Torrance replied. "Especially when it comes to families like yours. Your father's welfare, your welfare, it's all connected, isn't it?" Before Emma could respond, Dr. Morrison appeared at her elbow with the smooth timing they had rehearsed. "Miss Callahan, your father asked me to give you this," he said, handing her a folded note that contained the predetermined signal for the operation to proceed. Emma opened the note and read the carefully crafted message that would appear innocuous to casual observation, but would tell any listener that Theodore Callahan was ready to cooperate with federal authorities. "Please tell Papa that I understand and that I'll be home soon," she said, loud enough for Torrance to hear clearly. Torrance's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but Emma caught the change and knew that her message had been received and interpreted correctly. Within minutes, he would be reporting to Sheriff Garrett that Theodore Callahan was ready to meet with his daughter, providing the opening that federal agents needed to take both men into custody. "If you'll excuse me," Emma said to Torrance, "I should find Judge Blackwood and thank him for his hospitality before I leave." She moved through the mansion's public rooms, her heart pounding as she completed her assigned reconnaissance while the trap closed around the criminal network. Through the windows, she could see movement in the darkness that told her federal agents were taking their final positions. In the judge's study, the conversation had grown more intense, voices dropping to the conspiratorial whispers of men discussing activities that could not bear public scrutiny. Emma positioned herself where she could overhear without seeming to eavesdrop, gathering final confirmation of the criminal conspiracy that would soon be exposed. "The territorial governor's investigation is getting too close," one of the men was saying. "We need to accelerate the timeline and liquidate some of our more exposed assets." "Including Callahan?" asked another voice that Emma recognized as belonging to a wealthy rancher from the next county. "Especially Callahan," Judge Blackwood replied. "He's become a liability that we can't afford to maintain. After tonight, the problem will be resolved permanently." Emma felt her blood turn to ice as she realized that her father's life was in immediate danger. The coded message she had delivered was meant to draw out the criminals, but it had also accelerated their plans to eliminate Theodore Callahan as a threat to their network. She slipped away from the study and made her way toward the mansion's front entrance, where she was supposed to exit normally and signal the federal agents that the evidence-gathering phase was complete. But as she approached the door, she saw Sheriff Garrett positioning himself to block her departure. "Leaving so soon, Miss Callahan?" Garrett asked with false concern. "The evening is just getting started." Emma realized that her cover had been blown, and that she was now trapped in a house full of people who would kill her without hesitation if they understood what she represented. Her hand moved instinctively to her reticule, where the small derringer provided minimal but real protection. "I promised Papa I wouldn't stay late," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "You know how fathers worry." "Indeed I do," Garrett replied, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Perhaps you should wait a few more minutes. I believe your father will be joining us shortly." Emma's heart raced as she understood the full implications of Garrett's words. Theodore Callahan was walking into a trap, and she was being held as bait to ensure his cooperation. The federal agents outside were expecting her signal, but she was no longer in a position to provide it safely. Through the window, she could see lanterns moving in the darkness as riders approached the mansion. Her father was coming, believing that he was answering his daughter's call for help, unaware that he was riding toward his death and potentially compromising the entire federal operation. The sound of the old bell in Black Ridge's church tower rang out across the darkness, its bronze voice cutting through the night air with the clear, resonant tone that had called the community to worship for 30 years. But tonight, Dr. Morrison was not summoning people to prayer. He was signaling that the federal operation had begun and that everyone who valued justice over corruption should take cover. Emma heard the bell and felt a surge of relief mixed with terror. Amos and the federal agents were moving, but she was still trapped inside the mansion with some of the most dangerous men in the territory. Sheriff Garrett's hand remained on his gun, and Judge Blackwood had emerged from his study with several armed associates who were clearly prepared for violence. "That's an interesting sound," Garrett said, tilting his head toward the window. "Church bells at this hour usually mean trouble." Emma's fingers closed around her mother's wedding ring through the fabric of her dress, drawing strength from the symbol of love and courage that had sustained 3 generations of women through their darkest moments. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, she would not allow fear to make her weak. "Perhaps someone is ill and needs the doctor," she suggested, though her voice carried little conviction. Judge Blackwood laughed, the sound as cold as winter wind through bare branches. "Miss Callahan, I think we can dispense with pretense now. Your little performance tonight was quite convincing, but not quite convincing enough." Through the mansion's windows, Emma could see muzzle flashes in the darkness as federal agents engaged Sheriff Garrett's deputies who had been stationed around the property. The sound of gunfire was getting closer, and she realized that Amos was fighting his way toward the mansion with the methodical precision of a military professional. "You see," Judge Blackwood continued, "we've known for some time that your father was keeping records that could prove embarrassing to certain business interests. What we didn't know was whether he had shared that information with anyone else. Tonight's little charade was designed to answer that question." Emma felt her blood run cold as she understood the full scope of the trap they had walked into. "You knew we were coming." "We suspected," Garrett replied, "but we needed confirmation. Your presence here tonight, along with the rather convenient positioning of certain federal agents around our property, has provided that confirmation quite nicely." The sound of splintering wood from the mansion's rear entrance told Emma that the federal assault was beginning in earnest. Judge Blackwood's associates moved quickly to defensive positions, their weapons appearing with practiced efficiency. These were not amateur criminals, but experienced killers who had been prepared for this moment. "However," Judge Blackwood said, his voice remaining conversationally calm despite the chaos erupting around them, "we are reasonable men. Your father's cooperation could still save both your lives, along with the lives of those federal agents who seem so eager to interfere in territorial affairs." Emma realized that she was being offered as a bargaining chip, her life and her father's freedom balanced against the success of the federal operation. It was exactly the kind of impossible choice that had trapped Theodore Callahan for years, and she understood with perfect clarity that accepting their terms would only delay the inevitable while allowing the corruption to continue. "No," she said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "We're done making deals with you." Emma pulled the derringer from her reticule just as the mansion's front door exploded inward. Amos appeared in the doorway like an avenging angel, his cavalry saber gleaming in his left hand, while his right held a military-issue revolver. Behind him, federal agents poured through the entrance with the disciplined efficiency of soldiers who had trained for exactly this type of operation. The next few seconds unfolded with the deadly choreography of men who understood that survival depended on speed and precision. Garrett drew his weapon first, but Amos was faster, his shot taking the corrupt sheriff center mass before the man's gun cleared its holster. Judge Blackwood's associates opened fire from their defensive positions, but they found themselves caught between federal agents advancing from multiple directions. Emma dropped to the floor as bullets whined overhead, her small weapon ready but unnecessary, as Amos and his men systematically eliminated the criminal leadership that had controlled Black Ridge for years. She watched in fascination and horror as the man who had saved her in a dark alley demonstrated the lethal skills that had once made him one of the Army's most effective officers. Judge Blackwood tried to retreat toward his study, perhaps hoping to reach a hidden weapon or escape route, but Amos intercepted him with the fluid grace of a predator. The blade of his cavalry saber came to rest against the judge's throat, and suddenly the room was filled with profound silence. "Cornelius Blackwood," Amos said in his official voice, "you are under arrest by authority of the United States Marshal Service for conspiracy, corruption, murder, and treason against the territorial government. The judge's face had gone pale, but his eyes still held the arrogance of a man who believed that money and influence could overcome any legal challenge. "You have no jurisdiction here, McCreedy. Whatever authority you think you possess died with your court-martial 15 years ago." Amos smiled, and the expression was more frightening than his anger had been. "Actually, Your Honor, my authority was restored 3 weeks ago, along with my rank and my commission. I am Major Amos McCreedy, United States Army, assigned to Special Territorial Operations, and you, sir, are going to face justice for the first time in your miserable life." Emma rose from the floor, her dress torn and her hair disheveled but her spirit intact. Around them, federal agents were securing the mansion and taking surviving criminals into custody. Through the windows, she could see that the battle for Black Ridge was ending as federal forces established control over the town's key positions. The old bell continued to ring, its bronze voice now proclaiming liberty instead of summoning help. Emma touched her mother's wedding ring and felt a deep sense of completion, knowing that justice had finally come to a place that had been shadowed by corruption for far too long. "Is it over?" she asked Amos as he sheathed his saber and holstered his weapon. "The fighting is over," he replied, though his expression remained cautious. "But justice is just beginning. We still have trials to prepare for, testimonies to gather, and a community to rebuild." Emma nodded, understanding that their victory tonight was just the first step in a longer process of healing and restoration. But as she looked around the mansion where so much evil had been planned and executed, she felt a profound sense of hope for the future. Black Ridge would never be the same, but perhaps that was exactly what it needed to become something better. 6 months after the night when federal agents restored legitimate authority to Black Ridge, Emma Callahan stood on the porch of a modest house overlooking the valley where Amos had built his mountain retreat. In her hands, she held a new deed bearing both their names, the legal document that symbolized their decision to build a future together rather than retreat into separate isolation. The house was larger than Amos's old cabin but still simple in its design, reflecting their shared preference for substance over ostentation. From the porch, they could see Black Ridge in the distance, transformed from a place of fear into a community where decent people could live and work without constantly looking over their shoulders. Theodore Callahan had been instrumental in the prosecutions that followed the federal operation, his detailed records providing the evidence needed to secure convictions against more than 40 criminals, ranging from local thugs to territorial politicians. The trials had been conducted in Denver under federal jurisdiction, ensuring that justice would not be compromised by local corruption. "The last of them was sentenced yesterday," Amos said, joining Emma on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and the morning newspaper. "Senator Morrison got 25 years in federal prison for conspiracy and racketeering." Emma accepted the coffee gratefully, though her attention was focused on the valley below, where new construction was visible throughout Black Ridge. "It's hard to believe how quickly things have changed. 6 months ago, I couldn't walk through town without feeling afraid. Now, children play in the streets after dark. The transformation had not been without cost. Several businesses had closed when their criminal connections were exposed, and some families had been forced to leave when their involvement in the corruption network became public knowledge. But the community that remained was healthier and more honest than Black Ridge had been in years. Dr. Morrison had been elected mayor in a special election, running unopposed after his role in exposing the criminal network made him the most trusted man in town. His first official act had been to establish a citizens' committee to oversee the selection of a new sheriff, ensuring that law enforcement would be accountable to the community rather than to criminal interests. "Your father seems to be enjoying his new role," Amos observed, pointing to a figure visible near the bank building. Theodore Callahan had been appointed Territorial Banking Commissioner, a position that allowed him to apply his knowledge of financial crimes to prevent other communities from suffering Black Ridge's fate. Emma smiled as she watched her father's purposeful stride. The weight of guilt and fear that had burdened him for years had been lifted, replaced by the satisfaction of work that served justice rather than compromise. Their relationship had deepened as they worked together during the trials, sharing experiences that few families could understand. "He says he finally feels like the man Mama married," Emma said softly. "For the first time in years, he can look at himself in the mirror without shame." The personal costs of their victory had been significant but manageable. Emma's reputation had been enhanced rather than damaged by her role in the federal operation, though she was now seen as someone far more formidable than the sheltered banker's daughter she had once appeared to be. Marriage proposals from eligible young men had continued to arrive, but she had politely declined them all. "Any regrets?" Amos asked, settling into the chair beside her with the easy comfort of a man who had finally found his place in the world. Emma considered the question seriously, thinking about the innocence she had lost and the comfortable illusions that had been shattered during their fight against corruption. But as she looked at the deed in her hands and the man beside her, she found it impossible to wish that events had unfolded differently. "None," she said firmly. "Everything we sacrificed was worth what we gained." Amos had been restored to active duty with the rank of major, but his assignment to territorial special operations allowed him to remain in the region while working to prevent the kind of criminal takeover that had nearly destroyed Black Ridge. His reputation within the army had been completely rehabilitated, and there was talk of promotion to lieutenant colonel if he chose to remain in service. "What about you?" Emma asked. "Do you miss the solitude of the mountains?" "I miss the simplicity sometimes," Amos replied honestly, "but I've learned that isolation isn't the same thing as peace. Real peace comes from knowing that you're living according to your principles, regardless of the cost." Their engagement had been announced the previous month, though the wedding would be a simple affair reflecting their shared preference for substance over ceremony. Emma wore her mother's engagement ring alongside a new band that Amos had fashioned himself from Wyoming gold, creating a symbol of continuity between past and future. The house they were building together represented more than a personal commitment. It was positioned to serve as a liaison point between federal authorities and local communities, allowing them to continue their work of preventing territorial corruption while building a life together. Their experiences had taught them that justice required constant vigilance, and they were prepared to provide that vigilance for as long as it was needed. "Sometimes I think about those men in the alley," Emma said, her voice thoughtful rather than fearful. "How different everything would have been if you hadn't been watching that night." "I think about it too," Amos replied, "but not because I regret what happened. I think about it because it reminds me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to do what's right despite the fear." Emma reached for his hand, feeling the callous strength that had saved her life and restored justice to their community. Their love had grown from shared danger and mutual respect, creating a foundation that was stronger than mere romantic attraction. They had seen each other at their worst and best, in situations where pretense was impossible and truth was the only option. As evening approached, they could see lights beginning to appear in Black Ridge, families gathering for supper in homes where children could sleep safely and parents could plan for the future without fear. The sight filled Emma with a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond personal happiness, to encompass the knowledge that their sacrifices had made a difference in the lives of people they would never meet. "Do you think we'll always be fighting battles like this?" she asked. "Probably," Amos replied with characteristic honesty, "but now we'll be fighting them together, and that makes all the difference." Emma leaned against his shoulder, watching the last light fade from the Wyoming sky, while stars began to appear overhead. In her pocket, her mother's locket rested against her heart, a reminder of the love and strength that had sustained her through the darkest moments of their struggle. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new responsibilities. But tonight she was content to sit beside the man who had taught her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the determination to do what was right, regardless of the cost. They had both found their purpose in the fight for justice, and together they would continue that fight for as long as their strength endured. The mountains stood eternal around them, having witnessed countless human struggles throughout the centuries. But in the small house where two people who had found each other in darkness planned their future together, there was a sense of completion that transcended the temporary nature of all human endeavor. Some stories end with revenge, others with romance. This one ended with something more valuable than either the quiet satisfaction of justice served and love earned through shared struggle against impossible odds. In a world where corruption seemed to triumph more often than righteousness, they had proven that good people could still make a difference when they found the courage to stand together against the darkness.